Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today is a Patreon request from Aaron Tesler. I'm talking about the new-ish album from Stoneburner called Apex Predator. Okay, Stoneburner is the alias for Stephen Archer, an industrial/tribal/darkwave artist who's been at it for about a decade under this name. Although he is a bit more well known for being one half of the electronic rock band Eagle Likeness, alongside singer Donna Lynch. Definitely getting a request here that puts me out of my element. I've gone on record many times saying that I tend not to care for metal or noise music or any stuff that explores the louder extremes, shall we say. So as per usual, you can probably take what I say here with a grain of salt. But that hasn't stopped me from continuing to try industrial music like this anyway. You know, just to keep an open mind, keep my intake of electronic music more varied. And it's obviously not like I haven't found plenty of quality out of what I have already heard in this genre. Now, I'll freely admit that I have not heard any other projects Stephen Archer's been involved with besides this one. I have briefly previewed through bits and pieces of them. Some of his earlier albums, like Songs in the Key of Arrakis, did catch my interest. I like the mix of world music influences with hard-hitting industrial grooves and rock guitars. Sounded like it'd be pretty interesting. Though some other albums explored a similar mix that didn't sound as well produced. And it seems he's been looking to involve his own vocals a bit more lately, which... not really sure if I'm feeling that, but... sure, I guess you can do that. The stuff I previewed through from Eagle Likeness didn't sound like it'd be up my alley quite as much. That leaned a lot more on the rock and metal side of the genre, which tends to not really be my thing. Although Donna Lynch is obviously a much better singer than Archer himself. Though again, I've only briefly previewed through like little bits of these albums. I haven't actually sat down to listen to any of this stuff in full. I'd honestly never even heard of Stoneburner before this request was sent in to me. Hearing a track and a half of this album and a surface-level 9 Inch Nails comparison very briefly popping into my mind is what convinced me to sit through their whole catalog recently, resulting in the video I posted last week. Although, as I kinda suspected, that marathon isn't actually going to be particularly relevant to this video. They may operate in the same genre. This album was produced by John Fryer, who also produced a good chunk of Pretty Hate Machine. But aside from that, Stoneburner does not sound like 9 Inch Nails. This album is a lot more up-tempo and energetic than most of NIN's stuff, which is a lot slower and takes itself way more seriously. I guess there is one solitary NIN track that this album did actually kind of remind me of, though, and that's Starfuckers Incorporated. Like, that track was way glitchier and more energetic than most of the other material they were putting out at the time, even implementing drum and bass breakbeats. And of course, there was a lot of gratuitous cursing that made the track half feel like a joke. This album doesn't have like a lot of breakbeats or anything, but the vibe I get out of that track is pretty close to the vibe I get out of this entire album. Especially the part about the gratuitous cursing. Like, Apex Predator does appear to set itself apart from much of the rest of the Stoneburner catalog in how much it focuses on Archer's own vocals. Which, while that is somewhat ambitious for an artist who clearly isn't used to that kind of thing, I don't think it actually plays to his strengths much at all. Like, Archer's own vocal presence and his lyrics are by far the worst part of this album. So full of, like, edgelordisms that seem to think they're really cool but come off more corny than anything. I mean, I do have particularly low patience for, like, edgelord-ish lyrics in general, so I might be biased toward against this kind of stuff, but still, like, this album, like I said, this was my first exposure to Stoneburner at all, and I gotta say, like, being introduced to this guy through The Return of the World Wolf, which is an industrial rap song where he compares himself to some kind of ancient eldritch being and a kaiju. That was probably not getting me off on the right foot. It sounded like something a 14-year-old would come up with. The instrumental was fine, very noisy and aggressive, but still pretty well balanced and, you know, big sounding. But that made Archer's voice feel all the more out of place on it, especially since the recording fidelity on his voice seems like it's of a slightly different sound quality to the backing track. It was just more goofy than anything, and it was not a good start, to say the least. But on the other hand, I suppose it's not like all industrial music is meant to be like deep or emotionally intense or anything. Like, Frontline Assembly is not a smart band. They frequently dip into ridiculousness. See that one track about making love to an alien. But I still managed to get into them and get a few keeper albums out of them just because they sounded cool. And I suspect the appeal of Stoneburner might not be too far away from that. Less about the lyrics, more about the overall sound of everything. But at the same time, I also feel like Archer does kinda want you to listen to at least some of these lyrics too. I think there's one track that's kind of about racism in The Fourth Dog. That one ends in him yelling at the audience to get off their asses and look at the bullshit that's happening in the real world. Although the more genuine and serious anger behind that sentiment directly follows a track called A Hurricane of Mouths, which only brought Sharknado to mind. I think this album may have a little bit of a tone problem. But that's nothing compared to the album's closer and lead single, Sellout, which... oh my freaking god. This one, yeah, I'm sorry, this was just flat out terrible. And not because it actually lives up to its title. Like, this is a joke song about how Stoneburner is pretending to sell out and making some catchy track that undermines his artistic cred and lures any unsuspecting, shallow new fans into listening to the rest of his stuff that sounds like, in his words, a fucking car crash. Like, this isn't actually much of a pop song at all. Sonically, it's just as abrasive and industrial as everything else here, but its attempt at a hook is just repetitive and inane, and the verses show him thinking he's being clever by taking aim at the music industry or something, and I just hate the outdated and self-important attitude behind it. As if he thinks it's not possible to make catchy music and retain artistic credibility at the same time, like we're stuck in the early 2000s, or yeah, this track is just such a freaking headache. Doubly so since he actually did make a pop-leaning track earlier on this album that wasn't basically ripping itself. Like, there's a track called Spectrum that features a vocal appearance from Donna Lynch doing the hook alongside Archer. And, you know, it's still an industrial track first and foremost, but it is much poppier than anything else here, with a really solid, catchy lead melody. And that was one of the best tracks here, funnily enough. Like, apparently the title of that one comes from how Archer is on the autistic spectrum, and, like, the track centers itself around his struggles on that end and, you know, feeling like a neglected outsider. And as someone who is probably also on this spectrum and has lived with obvious debilitating ADHD all his life, I can definitely relate to that. See, that's not shallower cred undermining, is it? But yeah, I've ragged on this album a lot, but the rest of it is not that bad. Like, I still tend not to care for Archer's vocals all that much, and how the recording fidelity on his voice sounds ever so slightly off, and I'll admit I was tuning out most of the other lyrics. Again, all the cursing mostly just served to make the album feel more adolescent than I'd want. But the instrumentals behind him always have a lot of care and attention to detail put into them. I may not get much visceral enjoyment out of the noisier and more fucking car crash leaning tracks like A Decade of Assassins or Grudge Fuck, but I can respect them for what they are. The latter is near completely lacking in any kind of melody or structure, but I can get behind it as the album's most out there experimental moment by far. And I like that part at the end with the pianos. I also quite liked the vocoder-driven, more electronic-leaning cuts, like Planet Amputation and Frozen Man. The former was the first moment on this album that properly pulled me in, one of the biggest highlights for me for sure. And the latter had another particularly solid hook that grew on me the more I heard it. I like all the build-up of No Light, No Spark, and how that pays off in a more abrasive, I guess slightly more Nine Inch Nails-ish sound that does sound properly menacing. The crashing noises of the title track and its chopped up yelling samples are pretty neat too. And I think my favorite track here overall was probably Contracting Iris, purely thanks to the fact that this one heavily samples Voyager by the Alan Parsons Project. Like, any reference to the Alan Parsons Project is an automatic win in my eyes, and the way he flipped that sample and transformed it into something else, I think that was really neat. But that's pretty much all I have to say on the topic of Apex Predator. And the album's fine. On a personal level, I absolutely do not see myself keeping this around. It already kind of had an uphill battle with me since this particular style tends not to be my thing to begin with. And there were lots of moments that openly frustrated me. Not to mention the fact that this album's opening and closing tracks are its worst and most irritating moments by far. But at the same time, I'd be lying if I said I got no enjoyment out of this at all. Like, there's still plenty of moments here that did work for me, enough to still land it in decent territory. And even a lot of the ones that didn't work, I can see the appeal of them for other people. So, I guess take that all as you will. It's not for me, but I don't know, maybe you'll find more to like in it than I did. I might have to try more of this guy's earlier stuff. That might be more up my alley than this was. I suspect this may not have been a particularly good starting point for me to get into his work, but in the meantime, I guess I'm feeling like a 6.3 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. There are some people. You want to add yourself to that list. The link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.